Irish literature comprises writings in the Irish, Latin, and English languages on the island of Ireland. The earliest recorded Irish writing dates from the 7th century and was produced by monks writing in both Latin and Early Irish. In addition to scriptural writing, the monks of Ireland recorded both poetry and mythological tales. There is a large surviving body of Irish mythological writing, including tales such as the Táin and Mad King Sweeny. The English language was introduced to Ireland in the 13th century, following the Norman conquest of Ireland. The Irish language, however, remained the dominant language of Irish literature down to the 19th century, despite a slow decline which began in the 17th century with the expansion of English power. The latter part of the 19th century saw a rapid replacement of Irish by English in the greater part of the country. At the end of the century, however, cultural nationalism displayed a new energy, marked by the Gaelic revival and more generally by the Irish literary revival. The Anglo-Irish literary tradition found its first great exponent in Jonathan Swift. Writers such as Lawrence Sterne, Oliver Goldsmith and Richard Brinsley Sheridan are often claimed for Ireland, though the lives and the works were essentially English. The same can be said of Oscar Wilde, Bram Stoker and C.S. Lewis, prominent writers who left Ireland to make a life in London. More recognizably, Irish writers included Lewis MacNeice, George Bernard Shaw and W.B. Yeats. The descendants of Scottish settlers in Ulster formed the Ulster Scots writing tradition, having an especially strong tradition of rhyming poetry. Though English was the dominant Irish literary language in the 20th century, much work of high quality appeared in Irish. A pioneering modernist writer in Irish was Pádraig O'Conor, and traditional life was given vigorous expression in a series of autobiographies by native Irish speakers from the West Coast, exemplified by the work of Thomas O'Criampton and Peig Sayers. The outstanding modernist prose writer in Irish was Meawtan O'Cadhain, and prominent poets included Meawtan O'Doire, Sean O'Riordan and Mera Mhacintsaoi. Prominent bilingual writers included Brendan Behan and Flann O'Brien. Two novels by O'Brien, At Swim, Two Birds and The Third Policeman, are considered early examples of postmodern fiction, but he also wrote a satirical novel in Irish called An Be Acute Tale Bocht. Liam O'Flaherty, who gained fame as a writer in English, also published a book of short stories in Irish. Most attention has been given to Irish writers who wrote in English and who were at the forefront of the modernist movement, notably James Joyce, whose novel Ulysses is considered one of the most influential of the century. The playwright Samuel Beckett, in addition to a large amount of prose fiction, wrote a number of important plays, including Waiting for Godot. Several Irish writers have excelled at short story writing, in particular Frank O'Connor and William Trevor. In the late 20th century, Irish poets, especially those from Northern Ireland, came to prominence with Derek Mann, John Montague, Seamus Heaney and Paul Muldoon. Other notable Irish writers from the 20th century include poet Patrick Kavanagh, dramatists Tom Murphy and Brian Friel, and novelists Edna O'Brien and John McGahern. Well-known Irish writers in English in the 21st century include Colm McCann, Anne Enright, Roddy Doyle, Sebastian Barry, Colm Toibin and John Banville, all of whom have all won major awards. Younger writers include Paul Murray, Kevin Barry, Emma Donoghue, Donald Ryan and dramatist Martin McDonagh. Writing in Irish has also continued to flourish. The Middle Ages, 500–1500. Irish has one of the oldest vernacular literatures in Western Europe. The Irish became fully literate with the arrival of Christianity in the 5th century. Before that time a simple writing system known as Otham was used for inscriptions. The introduction of Latin led to the adaptation of the Latin alphabet to the Irish language and the rise of a small literate class, both clerical and lay. The earliest Irish literature consisted of original lyric poetry and versions of ancient prose tales. The earliest poetry, composed in the 6th century, illustrates a vivid religious faith, describes the world of nature, and was sometimes written in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. The Blackbird of Belfast Loch, a fragment of syllabic verse probably dating from the 9th century, has inspired reinterpretations and translations in modern times by John Montague, John Hewitt, Seamus Heaney, Kieran Carson, and Thomas Kinsella, as well as a version into modern Irish by Thomas O'Flynn. The Book of Armagh is a 9th-century illuminated manuscript written mainly in Latin, containing early texts relating to St. Patrick and some of the oldest surviving specimens of Old Irish. It is one of the earliest manuscripts produced by an insular church to contain a near-complete copy of the New Testament. The manuscript was the work of a scribe named Dominic of Armagh. Dominic read the first part of the book in 807 or 808 for Patrick's heir Torbark. It was one of the symbols of the office for the Archbishop of Armagh. The Annals of Ulster cover years from AD 431 to AD 1540 and were compiled in the territory of what is now Northern Ireland. Entries up to AD 1489 were compiled in the late 15th century by the scribe Rua Ira Oluwanin, under his patron Cathalog MacMagnusa on the island of Bellile Lough Erne. The Ulster Cycle, written in the 12th century, is a body of medieval Irish heroic legends and sagas of the traditional heroes of the Allied in what is now eastern Ulster and northern Leinster, particularly counties Armagh, Down and Louth. The stories are written in Old and Middle Irish, mostly in prose, interspersed with occasional verse passages. The language of the earliest stories is datable to the 8th century, and events and characters are referred to in poems dating to the 7th. After the Old Irish period, there is a vast range of poetry from medieval and Renaissance times. By degrees the Irish created a classical tradition in their own language. Verse remained the main vehicle of literary expression, and by the 12th century questions of form and style had been essentially settled, with little change until the 17th century. Medieval Irish writers also created an extensive literature in Latin. This Hiberno-Latin literature was notable for its learned vocabulary, including a greater use of loanwords from Greek and Hebrew than was common in medieval Latin elsewhere in Europe. The literary Irish language was a sophisticated medium with elaborate verse forms, and was taught in Bardic schools both in Ireland and Scotland. These produced historians, lawyers, and a professional literary class which depended on the aristocracy for patronage. Much of the writing produced in this period was conventional in character, in praise of patrons and the families, but the best of it was of exceptionally high quality and included poetry of a personal nature. Gofraid Finn O'Dallai, Tadhg Ogohuijin and Eochada Hiahusa were among the most distinguished of these poets. Every noble family possessed a body of manuscripts containing genealogical and other material, and the work of the best poets was used for teaching purposes in the Bardic schools. In this hierarchical society, fully trained poets belonged to the highest stratum. They were court officials but were thought to still possess ancient magical powers. Women were largely excluded from the official literature, though female aristocrats could be patrons in their own right. An example is the 15th-century noblewoman Maigre Agnesia Ball, praised by the learned for her hospitality. At that level a certain number of women were literate. and some were contributors to an unofficial corpus of courtly love poetry known as Dantegrada. Prose continued to be cultivated in the medieval period in the form of tales. The Norman invasion of the 12th century introduced a new body of stories which influenced the Irish tradition, and in time translations were made from English. Irish poets also composed the Dincenches, a class of onomastic texts recounting the origins of place names and traditions concerning events and characters associated with the places in question. Since many of the legends related concerned the acts of mythic and legendary figures, the Dincenches is an important source for the study of Irish mythology. Irish mythological and legendary saga cycles. There are four principal epic cycles in early Irish literature. The first of these is the Mythological Cycle, which concerns the Irish pagan pantheon, the Táin. Second is the Ulster Cycle, mentioned above, also known as the Red Branch Cycle of the Heroic Cycle, which concerns events during the legendary reign of King Conor MacNessor in Ulster in the 1st century BC. The Ulster Cycle includes the Táin Bó Gael, the so-called Iliad of the Gael, and its hero, the warrior Cuchulainn, a figure comparable to the Greek hero Achilles, known for his terrifying battle frenzy, or Rhysstrad. Third is a body of romance woven round Finn mac Cumhal, his son Oisin, and his grandson Oscar. In the reigns of the High Kings Conn of the 100 Battles, his son Arto Enfa, and his grandson Cormac mac Ait, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. This cycle of romance is usually called the Fenian cycle because it deals so largely with Finn mac Cumhal and his Fianna. Fourth is the Historical Cycle, or Cycle of the Kings, stemming from Irish court bards' duty to recount the histories and genealogies of the dynasties they served. The historical cycle ranges from the almost entirely mythological Labrador Loingsech, who allegedly became High King of Ireland around 431 BC, to the entirely historical Brian Boru, who reigned as High King of Ireland in the 11th century AD. The historical cycle includes the late medieval tale Beal Shuavni, which has influenced the works of T.S. Eliot and Flann O'Brien, among others. Unusually among European epic cycles, the Irish sagas were written in prose, with verse interpolations expressing heightened emotion, although usually found in recensions of the later medieval period. Many of these works are linguistically archaic, and thus throw light on pre-Christian Ireland. The early modern period, 1500 to 1800. The 17th century saw the tightening of English control over Ireland and the suppression of the traditional aristocracy. This meant that the literary class lost its patrons, since the new nobility were English speakers with little sympathy for the older culture. The elaborate classical metres lost their dominance and were largely replaced by more popular forms. This was an age of social and political tension, as expressed by the poet P. O'Broider and the anonymous authors of Parliament Cloentomise, a prose satire on the aspirations of the lower classes. Prose of another sort was represented by the historical works of Geoffrey Keating and the compilation known as the Annals of the Four Masters. The consequences of these changes were seen in the 18th century. Poetry was still the dominant literary medium, and its practitioners were poor scholars, often educated in the classics at local schools and schoolmasters by trade. Such writers produced polished work in popular metres for a local audience. This was particularly the case in Munster, in the southwest of Ireland, and notable names included Owen Drew O'Sulliabine and Eogan O'Rath I of Sly Bluashra. A certain number of local patrons were still to be found, even in the early 19th century. and especially among the few surviving families of the Gaelic aristocracy. Irish was still an urban language, and continued to be so well into the 19th century. In the first half of the 18th century, Dublin was the home of an Irish-language literary circle connected to the O'Neachton family, a group with wide-ranging continental connections. There is little evidence of female literacy for this period, but women were of great importance in the oral tradition. They were the main composers of traditional laments. The most famous of these is Táin ad Tweedleary, composed in the late 18th century by Aiblinn Dovney Chonal, one of the last of the Gaelic gentry of West Kerry. Compositions of this sort were not committed to writing until collected in the 19th century. The manuscript tradition, well after the introduction of printing to Ireland, works in Irish continued to be disseminated in manuscript form. The first printed book in Ireland was the Book of Common Prayer. Access to the printing press was hindered in the 1500s and the 1600s by official caution, although an Irish version of the Bible was published in the 17th century. A number of popular works in Irish, both devotional and secular, were available in print by the early 19th century, but the manuscript remained the most affordable means of transmission almost until the end of the century. Manuscripts were collected by literate individuals and were copied and recopied. They might include material several centuries old. Access to them was not confined to the literate, since the contents were read aloud at local gatherings. This was still the case in the late 19th century in Irish-speaking districts. Manuscripts were often taken abroad, particularly to America. In the 19th century, many of these were collected by individuals or cultural institutions. The Anglo-Irish tradition. In the 18th century, Jonathan Swift, a powerful and versatile satirist, was Ireland's first earliest notable writer in English. Swift held positions of authority in both England and Ireland at different times. Many of Swift's works reflected support for Ireland during times of political turmoil with England, including Proposal for Universal Use of Irish Manufacture, Drapier's Letters, and A Modest Proposal, and earned him the status of an Irish patriot. Oliver Goldsmith, born in County Longford, moved to London, where he became part of the literary establishment. Though his poetry reflects his youth in Ireland, he is best known for his novel The Vicar of Wakefield, his pastoral poem The Deserted Village, and his plays The Good-Natured Man and She Stoops to Conquer. Edmund Burke was born in Dublin and came to serve in the House of Commons of Great Britain on behalf of the Whig Party, and establish a reputation in his oratory and published works for great philosophical clarity as well as a lucid literary style. Literature in Ulster. Scots. In the 18th century, Scots, mainly Gaelic-speaking, had been settling in Ulster since the 15th century, but large numbers of Scots-speaking lowlanders, some 200,000, arrived during the 17th century following the 1610 plantation, with the peak reached during the 1690s. In the core areas of Scots settlement, Scots outnumbered English settlers by 5 or 6 to 1. In Ulster Scots-speaking areas, the work of Scottish poets, such as Alan Ramsay and Robert Burns, was very popular, often in locally printed editions. This was complemented by a poetry revival and nascent prose genre in Ulster, which started around 1720. A tradition of poetry and prose in Ulster Scots began around 1720. The most prominent being the Rhyming Weaver poetry, publication of which began after 1750, though a broadsheet was published in Strabane in 1735. These weaver poets looked to Scotland for the cultural and literary models but were not simple imitators. They were inheritors of the same literary tradition and followed the same poetic and orthographic practices. It is not always immediately possible to distinguish between traditional Scots writing from Scotland and Ulster. Among the rhyming weavers were James Campbell, James or Thomas Beggs,